Namaste. Welcome to Such Conversations Matter. Conversations which represent the future we should have. I'm your host, Saurabh Nanda. Today's guests are Ramesh Balasundaram and Binu Ramesh. This couple leads an NGO called BalUtsav, wherein they are impacting government school children spread over 5 states. They are headquartered out of Bangalore in India. Now, their journey is quite interesting because they both, before starting BalUtsav and before actually getting married, they both were working in the learning and development space in their very successful corporate careers where they had spent more than 10 years. But the passion to change things, the passion to impact education and facilitate education brought them to the development space. And that's how BalUtsav came about to be in 2008, 2009. Since then, they have been able to impact more than 800,000 students across 5 different states and many government schools. Today, they are fortunate enough to have government schools approaching them so that BalUtsav can help facilitate education over there as well. So what does BalUtsav do exactly? Well, they help government schools in urban and rural settings improve the education ecosystem. It's not only about books and teachers and classrooms and blackboards and whiteboards or providing devices, especially after the lockdown and COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also about creating a safe environment where children would like to come and visit and stay and learn. Whether it be creating washroom for girls or whether it be enabling conversations among students about how they felt about COVID-19, BalUtsav tries to do a lot of these things. Their impact is, well, it's very difficult to quantify, but the very fact that they have been approached by so many different schools and NGOs today defines it. And that also brings us to the fact that what we're going to discuss in this conversation will go beyond BalUtsav itself. It'll go about the transition from a corporate life to an NGO life, and it'll also talk about the entire developmental ecosystem and how it's changing and how the youth of India today needs to step up and work in this space to make India and the world a better space. So much and much more coming up. So let me invite them over. Hi Ramesh, hi Binu, how are you?
All good. Namaste.
Thank you for having us over, Saurabh. Doing great.
Well, it's great to have you here. I mean, I know it's been more than a month's conversations and to and fro happening before we could finalize this slot, and I'm really happy that we were able to do so. And thank you so much for taking out the time to be here today. Um, Let me just start off by asking you guys, and I've been asking this question from the beginning of when I began this podcast during the lockdown in 2020, as to how have the last 2 years been for you both?
Sure. So, first of all, Saurabh, thank you so much for having us over. It's a pleasure. And happy independence to you and everyone who's listening to the podcast. See, the last 2 years certainly, Saurabh, were not something that we anyhow dreamt of. Nobody, right, across the globe. Very challenging. There was nothing promising or no ray of hope which anybody was seeing it through. However, saying that, continuing in this journey, continuing in the space where we do have people who are dedicatedly wanting to do a lot of service. At Balitsa, what we decided or what we felt the requirement was that yes, we have to ensure that the pandemic doesn't eat onto everyone, right? So we need to move forward and do something more on ground per se. Though education is, which is something very close to our heart, that is our forte, that is where Balitsa has been focusing on. But the need of the hour at that point in time was to ensure that the children, their families, the community, the people around us are safe to move forward. So, under the Daitwa program that Balutsav runs, we run over here. which is a disaster response initiative. Well, we created a model where we reached out to the people who are in need on ground, whether it was food, whether it was oxygen, whether it was clothes, whether it was water, whatever the demand was. We tried and reached out to like-minded individuals, collected not only funds but also volunteers who came forward and supported us in distributing the requirements on ground. So that was one of the programs that we immediately initiated during the pandemic. And then, yes, people were disturbed at various levels. It is not only personally, emotionally, but also the children. The children in per se, they didn't know what to do at the end of the day. Elders like us, we could go out and speak to each other. However, the children, the youngsters, the toddlers, or the ones who were going to school, suddenly everything came to a standstill for them. For us, it also became all the more important to ensure that their studies are not disturbed. Schools were shut down, they couldn't step out anywhere. We came up with a solution, or we came up with a thought where we wanted to take the curriculum to their doorstep. We reached out to the principal, we reached out to the community, the parents, and brought in a hybrid model of education for the kids who were under the BalUtsav banner to begin with, and then we started exploring more options over there. So we had internet-enabled classrooms always there in our flagship programs, which was Aishala and Sampurnishala. However, since the children were not coming to the school, what we thought is we should have tablets in the hands of the teachers as well, so in case they can reach out to the communities and the students and deliver the content over there, the syllabus over there. Then gradually what happened was the teachers were also not allowed to move and reach out to the students. Then we had companies who were dealing in content, who created content, who wanted to liaise with Balitsa. They gave us licenses, and we ensured that these licenses were downloaded on each and every gadget that the parents had. The best part about these licenses were it was free of cost given to us. It was free of cost given to the students. And the best part, at the end of the day, the children had the learning going on for them. It did not stop. Yes, initially there was a little bit of an hiatus, but later on it continued. Uh, Pleasant a way of approaching things at the end of the day, because now they have started coming back to the school, and it is an add-on for them too. Yeah.
That is amazing, and I'm gonna delve deep into it throughout the conversation. Um, Ramesh, would you like to add something to it? And also, Binu, I mean, what about personally? How did you go through these 2 years, and how did you take that? Would love to know that.
So, Saurabh, when the lockdown was announced, we were, yes, certainly taken aback, not personally, emotionally as well. Uh, we were there at home only for 2 days. And after those 2 days, it was our responsibility. Trust us, we're not saying for the sake of saying, but it is our responsibility, and it was at that point in time as well. We wanted to be on ground and do something. We really wanted to do it. And thankfully, the local government bodies, they supported us, gave us permissions to be there on ground and bring in more volunteers. Emotionally very draining when we saw people on ground without water, without food, and no, specifically the second wave that had hit everyone around, which was where hospitalization became a major issue. So emotionally really draining, but we had to keep ourselves going on. We wanted to every day we wanted to create a new story and be there on ground and work towards it. So pulled up our socks, and yes, we were there. Thankfully, it came as a blessing in disguise for us, because we both of us started doing a lot of meditation and a lot of other activities long time back. And I think this was probably the time period when it came as a hands-on for us. we were able to sail through it in a more, what do we say, in a more stable fashion. Yes.
Thank you. Just taking on from where Binu left, I think in March 2020, when the pandemic first hit, the virus was new, the virus was unknown, so we really didn't know what we were getting ourselves into, right? There was a lot of uncertainty for sure. Will it last days? Will it last weeks? Will it last months? We didn't know, right? But I think the bigger question was every person in the social sector, right? All that they keep striving for through their life, the various training programs they sit through, the passion they want to carry. I think the real test came in March of 2020, right? Because it was really an opportunity to put your abilities to test and make yourself available to be able to work in such unfamiliar territories, right? We didn't know what we were working on. We didn't know the scale. The virus was absolutely unfamiliar. So the ability to put it all together, like one piece of it was how learning was disrupted, and we for a fact said, okay, let's take it off. We'll get into this in some time because just what was being showcased was about how everybody's spelling doomsday, right? That this is going to come crashing down, the numbers are going to will keep swelling. But it was all just doomsday prediction. But the ability to get there on the ground and make ourselves available to people in need, right? Those who are carrying, at least 80% of the migrants who were leaving, the only belonging they carried were these large 20-liter distemper boxes, right? That was their entire life savings that they had on their shoulder and were walking. Right? The ability to be able to go out and make food available for them, the ability to go out and make water available to the policemen who were enforcing the lockdown, right? The ability to make available sanitary pads for women who were taking these 3-day, 4-day journeys back home. The ability to make ORS available, right, for children who are otherwise getting dehydrated. I think the first couple of weeks just went into that, and it was a constantly evolving model. It's not like there was this one thing that we did and it held good. By about June, we realized that this virus wasn't going anywhere, right? And we had to bring the focus back on learning. And because it was easier to keep schools closed, a lot of people chose to do that because there were no right answers. The fear of the pandemic coming back was still huge. So around June is when we started now putting our head minds back together, saying, can we bring our focus back on education? Can we ensure that children are back in schools? And what can we do to enable that? Right? And like Binu had mentioned, while some of these pieces were already there, our entire models until then were school centric in nature, right? So the agent of change was the school, and the pandemic ensured that the school was inaccessible or unreachable. So we had to evolve a mechanism where learning could continue, not because of the school, but in spite of the school, right? And that's where the ability to take blended learning went in. We didn't have data, so we didn't know how many of them have access to a device, right? Is it 10%? Is it 100%? We don't know. So it was a work in progress. But looking back at the last 2 years, I think it was quite. We can with reasonable success say that we've been able to get learning to continue, not just information flow happening from person A to person B, but in the best possible way to allow learning to continue.
That is that is quite amazing, and thank you so much to both of you for doing that, and all the thousands of other individuals and organizations who had actually stepped up during that time. It's quite easy to critically analyze the situation and then blame the authorities and all that, but it's quite difficult to come up with solution and actually be there to implement those solutions. And you guys contributed, and thank you so much for doing that. um, it's it's quite shocking in a way to see that you know even after a few months into the pandemic, the quality of learning in schools did not really radically change or improve. It was going like that, and I meet, being a career counselor, I get a lot of queries from a lot of parents and students now that the last 2 years the impact of those last 2 years is showing now on their children, especially if they have been transitioning from, I would say, secondary classes to senior secondary classes. And that had been quite acute in the case of students coming from marginalized backgrounds and government schools, because they not only had to face the loss of education, but also they could see the financial distress at home, also the entire world crumbling around them in a way, because they were the hardest hit, because now things they were taking for granted suddenly became everyday survival problems. I remember discussing this on a forum as well in early 2020. And how did you manage that with students? Because that is, as you said, there are no right answers to such problems. uh, what could you observe and what could you bring out from those situations when you were doing these things?
So the first couple of weeks, Saurabh, was really about ensuring that we were able to get back the connect into school, because the fear of, like, with social distancing being the norm, we're saying don't meet people, and, like, such narratives being run. The ability to first go out and establish connect back again itself was the first primary exercise to do. The bigger issue, and this was especially more challenging with children, is for a child to understand what is going on, right? I mean, usually you pick up a news channel or a newspaper. The nature of information available there is not educative in nature, right? It is more reporting hard facts, right? So many people didn't have an ambulance to get into the hospital. So many people passed away yesterday. I mean, we had certain news channels with tickers on about what the count was. And while it is suitably designed for an adult's consumption, right? The ability for a child to understand what was going on and not be able to speak to somebody was even more challenging. So around August, we began these phone catch-up sessions with our children, where we just did a one-to-one mapping with volunteers who would just go out and either have a 6 week or a 52-week module that they would work with children in terms of a just check-in kind of a call. Like, understand what's going on, take an educative route to explain what's happening around them, right? Give them the required information. And while it was still uncertain for most people around, the ability to at least be able to speak to them in a language that they would understand, right, was one of the key pieces that we got out. The second piece was, clearly, if it's about survival and education, the choice is about survival, and that's where the focus for most people went. But to realize that about 8 to 10 weeks into the pandemic, that we've been able to, I wouldn't say we've been able to survive, but we realize that we are in this fight for the long haul, right? It's not a bad nightmare that's going to be over in a few weeks, but something that we're going to have to live with. When that thought started settling in, the ability to go out and reach out to more children, reach out to more teachers, and begin conversations saying, what can we do now, right? Uh, to be able to continue to work in unfamiliar territories, to continue to ensure that we don't have data, real time data, but we can't keep waiting for that to come for us to start responding. But get started with what we've got and evolve along the way was where the focus came in from, right? The mentoring program was very well received, especially by children, and there was greater focus on girl children who were supported through this initiative. The ability for teachers to believe that, hey, such content needs to be made available, and learning cannot happen with just the models we've used so far, but we need to look at, like, for example, uh, let's say a class 6, we're teaching them about eclipse, right? Already the ability to understand a concept like eclipse in a two-dimensional fashion on a blackboard is quite uphill, right? For a child to understand how the sun, the moon, and the earth come together, how it's rotating, it's revolving, and we are able to see this through. For a teacher to then think of doing this on a sheet of pen and paper, showcasing it on, let's say, a WhatsApp, and getting children to learn is extremely difficult, right? I mean, they are doing everything that they can with the available resources, but to be able to, uh, for a child to be able to decipher or understand what is being done, uh, and how this works, unfortunately, a lot of learning for a short while got into information sharing and not learning, right? And therefore, there was a very important need for us to be able to bring that change back, because learning is a lot more than just giving away information, right? So to be the ability to steer that, to bring it back into action, and you continue to, like Binu was mentioning, take a blended approach, right? So while schools are open, the schools should continue to function the way it does and thrive. And if there is a situation when the schools shut down for whatever reason, like there's another wave, there is a new variant, we don't know what it is, at least it had opened up the doors that schools could get closed again, right? So we had to keep the plan B ready, as a clear idea saying if this happens again, we shouldn't be as unprepared as we are right now. And when I say us, I'm talking of the entire system, right? I think that's been the huge learning, and the biggest focus, to continue to put things together. Anything to add?
Binu, I actually wanted to like add another dimension before you answer this question. You talked about the importance of meditation for both of you during these last 2 years, and I think a lot of people, including myself, I resonate with that a lot. I mean, before 2020, I wouldn't have thought that I would be going on a journey like this, but I personally believe now that without spirituality, you do not have that centeredness and that core strength emotionally and mentally to go through these things, to these tremendous challenges and changes which are happening around us. um, and it is equally and although children are extremely resilient, much more resilient than we think they are, um, but their centeredness, their spiritual growth, where do you think that part, how did they supplement that part, like we consciously did it for ourselves? What do you think, how the children managed it?
Okay. Sure. So, speaking on behalf of the children, I would say their spirituality comes in from playing around. So, for them, yes, they don't see black and white, things in that perspective. They see it as it comes, right? So, for them, they will not look at logic. If I have to go back a couple of years, when I was a kid, I so remember coming in from a joint extended family, and we'll be like around 10, 12 of us, all cousins and brothers and sisters and friends around, uh, just playing. Even if the neighborhood there'll be somebody fighting, we wouldn't care. It was like, oh, fine, that aunt is fighting, no problem, she'll resolve it herself. It's more like, fair enough, there are solutions. So for them, it is just being themselves, and we should let kids be themselves. We should not impose things on them. However, saying that, I strongly believe, or we all at BalUtsav strongly believe, that there has to be a point wherein, uh, uh, at a certain age, the child should start, or the guardians should start initiating them into a path where they can see things holistically, right? But till a certain age, let them be themselves, let them play. They know a way out. I think they are there to teach us. So we learn a lot from them every day. When we go to a school, we know, there'll be these PPTs and nice icebreakers that we would have created. But however, the moment we enter the premises, it is coming in from them. We don't have to initiate a conversation over there. So they'll be the one who'll voluntarily come forward and will start initiating the conversation with us. So just let them be where they are, and let them just play around and be themselves. Don't try to impose things on them, is what we strongly believe in. Yeah. So that's their spiritual, the Zen movement for
Perfect.
them.
Absolutely. I think the moment is right now for both of you to actually share a little bit about your professional journeys and how you ended up starting BalUtsav, and how the journey for BalUtsav itself has been, some of the projects and so on, because nobody can do it better than you two.
So the idea of Balutsu really germinated when Binu and I were quoting each other. We were quoting each other for about 2 years before we tied the knot, and the idea really was born then. From two standpoints, both of us had a corporate job. We're coming from two extremely different cultural backgrounds. Uh, we were trying to think of what we would be doing together after we tie the knot. And at that point of time, there were reports of nonprofits in India, the number of nonprofits in India, and I think the defining moment was there was this one report, and I'm talking of around 2008-9, which spoke about 2008, 2009, which spoke about the fact that there were about 3.3 million NGOs in India, right? And we were a population of about a billion people then. So a simple back of the envelope calculation says that there was one NGO for every 400 people. I mean, more than the number of schools, more than the number of hospitals in the country. So the first question we were looking at then was saying, hey, if we've got so many nonprofits and each one being able to handle, let's say, 400 people, then most of our problems should be history, right? However, that's not the case. So why isn't that the case, and what can we do about it? Number one. Number two is the the work that's being carried out in all probability is a work in progress with almost no end date, right? The government is trying to solve the same problem, the private sector is trying to solve the same problem, the non-profits are trying to solve the same problem, and still there is no end date in sight. I'm not even saying the end date needs to be close. I'm saying even if we agree on that this has to be 30 years from now, 50 years from now, as long as we've got a definite plan to which we are working, we are good to go. But that wasn't the case. uh, so we took a little bit of a deep dive to understand what is wrong with the model. Are the problems so huge that they cannot be solved, uh, or are we not doing something right? And while we clearly believe that the problems were large, the bigger question was the approach that we were taking to problem solving itself was very different, right? Most people take this approach of doing what I would call as a feel good exercise, right? I want to go. I see somebody in trouble. I immediately want to go out and do something about it, which is a great first step. But most people stop at that. Very few people go to the next level and saying, okay, it's not just about me feeling good, but I want to be able to do good as well, and therefore we do something a little beyond that. Like, you see somebody hungry, you've not just bought them food, you've also possibly gotten them a meal for their next meal. Like, maybe you've given them lunch and you've also given them some resources to buy dinner, or something to that extent. But the biggest challenge was the ability to look at it from problem solving, like, from a lens of problem solving. Understand why is this problem on, what is the scale, and how do we solve this in a strategic fashion, right, with a clear blueprint. So that's where it really started. And since both of us had a corporate background, both of us have been trainers at some point of time in our lives, the ability to be able to, and we facilitated a variety of sessions for the leadership. We said, can we bring some of those learnings and apply it here, right? Where we take up strategic problem solving and problem solving at scale. So when we first started, we said, okay, if we can do this to 400 people in the country, I think it's a great success. Of course, a lot of water has flown between then and now, and the numbers of 400 is something that we left behind quite a while ago. But just the ability to bring this together, use problem solving. And we said, if we are really doing problem solving, what problems do we start with, right? India's got the highest number of children, 400 million children at last count, right? And still counting. Uh, with about 40 crore children in India, we said anything that we want to solve can be solved if we start working with today's children. So the thought behind BalUtsav was, can we start working on tomorrow's problems by working with today's children? And to further that, when we said, okay, we'll start working with children, at least back then, the thinking or the way children were being portrayed. When you said Indian children, it was almost always about children with torn clothes, showing their ribs, looking deep into the camera. And while we don't deny that such children exist, uh, we are quite clear that that's not the only kind of children who exist, right? The happiest times of our lives when we were children, right? And we then came up with this model saying, can we therefore take a celebratory approach to problem solving? And that's where the name BalUtsav conceptualized from. Bal and Utsav, the happiest times of a childhood, Bal and Utsav, coming together to take celebratory approaches to problem solving. So we, over the years, we are still very proud to say that it's now over a decade. We are hitting our 14th year quite soon since the time we first started. And if you visit any of our website, our social media pages, you are definitely going to go back with a smile. You're definitely going to go back with feeling a little more inspired about what is possible by celebratory problem solving models rather than spelling doom. Even at the thick of the pandemic, there was not a single post which went out saying if you don't pay money, somebody's going to die. I mean, the idea was not to do, for want of a better word, poverty selling. The idea was not to come back and say, hey, listen, the problem is serious. There is a sense of urgency. But we said we will only speak of hope and inspiration and not about spelling doomsday. So, professionally, also, uh, to answer, like, slightly touch upon a question you had last asked us about, just the ability to continue to keep the hope and inspiration on and keep delving further into it and delivering better, I think has been one of the biggest coping mechanisms for us to be able to continue to operate at scale and be able to inspire a lot more people.
So, Saurabh, I'm basically from Delhi, born and brought up there, completed my education. I come from a family who run education institutes in Delhi. There are two schools that my family runs. So education has always been a little close to my heart, per se. So we have grown up listening to the conversations wherein dad and my Bade Papa will have at home. And at one point in time, there was also this thought process of joining them and be a part of the entire ecosystem. However, they run private schools. So that is a completely different domain altogether. Never thought, never even strived that in the near future I'll be probably working in the same space. However, not the private sector, but the public education system, wherein the need is really huge. As we are working here for the last 11 years, we realize there is so much that can be that has to be done in this space. Saying that, Ramesh, as he rightly mentioned, we both were in the learning and development space and worked there for good 10, 12 years. There is a lot of learning that we brought in personally to BalUtsav. Uh, it is certainly helping us right now. Uh, uh, this is a snippet about my personal space. However, my heart, if I have to look back at things in perspective, whether I would have been happier while I was working in the private sector, education, yes, per se, that is the umbrella, but maybe not in the private schools running the system over there. However, I think the fulfillment, that achievement is more when after spending 11 years, it's a short span of time. There's a lot more to be done. But I feel that yes, I am on the right path. Uh, just to put certain numbers in perspective, there are around 15 lakh schools in India and 10 lakh are government schools. So the number that we're talking about, so it is yes. And when you visit a government school, 10 lakh government schools, we haven't visited all of them, but wherever we are working so far, there is so much to be desired for. There is a need on ground. And the need is not something that, as an individual, Ramesh, myself, or our team BalUtsav can only do. But we need so many like minded individuals coming together and revamping the ecosystem.
Great. How does the language barrier work for you? How do you overcome that?
Ramesh doesn't have a language barrier over here. He's born in.
Well, at least in Karnataka, he doesn't. I'm assuming other places
So
he
for
might.
most of us born here, we end up being able to at least understand and speak about four of the South Indian languages, like, with all the friends that we grew up with. So that's not been as much of a challenge. I wouldn't say it's not a challenge at all, but it's not as much of a challenge. But even to perhaps just give you a sneak peek, uh, Binu has done phenomenally well in being able to get to work with the various government teams.
Thank
Right?
you.
They clearly go out and the the efforts that everyone makes to be understood, right, and to understand is huge, is phenomenal, right? And I think the interesting piece is when they realize that this is being done for the larger good, the smaller element of um, uh, linguistic pride, the idea of being able to fight over language, all of that kind of takes a back seat across the states when they realize that the notion or the intention is to do something much bigger, right? And I can't think of a single place where language has been a problem so far, right? Yes, we may. We speak to them in a language we know, they speak to us in a language they understand, and more often than not there may be a team member from our end who speaks the language, and like, if there's any gaps that need to be
Mm-hmm.
filled, they step in. But I can't think of anywhere where language has been a challenge so far, right? And while we predominantly work in the south, a lot of our disaster response work, we keep coming back to the north. A lot of government licensing work happens in the north. So uh, Binu, of course, is a lot more fluent in the language up there. We all keep playing catch up in terms of picking up the language there as well. But I think the ability to be able to speak, understand, and be understood when the goal is much larger is something else altogether.
That's perfectly explained, because there's a reason why I asked this question deliberately. It's more of a rhetorical, redundant question, because a lot of people have these doubts as to if they want to create impact or do something about something somewhere. People start thinking on how anybody would think, cultural differences, language differences, and so on. What they don't understand is when you're all working towards the same goal, it doesn't really matter. You will find a way, because that's what humans do. Which brings me to my next small question before we move on to the next theme. Both of you spent more than a decade in the corporate sector. It's a very structured, very transactional, very professional, and very different environment. But then you move to a completely different domain, and the working culture, the structures, they might as well be from Mars. How did you cope up?
You want to take that?
So I'll just give you a one word answer, one statement answer to this. We brought in the best practices from the corporate sector to the NGO sector. We did. So we initiated the whole concept of processes at BalUtsav. So we have processes here. We do follow certain rigid, streamlined day in, day out activities as well. So these are the best practices, and trust us, it works. It helps in both the sectors. Uh, the only difference, yeah, I'm gonna leave it at it, and I think I'll have Ramesh take it forward from there on. Yes.
So sort of really, I think the both sectors have their own advantages, right? And the ability to marry the two is where I think the sweet spot lies. Right? And this is more from the spiritual learning piece. But the corporate sector is more like a manicured lawn, right? Everything's picture perfect, right? The grass is all trimmed, it's all prim and proper. There's somebody to water the plants, somebody to trim the plants, somebody to go out and beautify the place. We've got all of that. The 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 world outside of that is more like a wild forest, right? There's still a rhythm there, right? It's just that it's not as visually appealing to somebody who looks at it or who's come only from a place of looking at a manicured lawn, right? It does not mean to say that there is no rhythm to a forest, right? Or a wild forest. There is a certain rhythm. Some of the best biodiversity practices are available in a forest, and nobody curated that. It just happened, right? So the ability to take some of the best practices from the corporate, first check for applicability in the new environment, and then to implement is where I think this starts getting interesting. For example, most often in the corporate sector, the the learnings come in a structured fashion, but a lot of it is also very transactional in nature, right? They are doing something because it's going to help them get a better hike. It's going to help them because they can get a vertical move into the next role, so on and so forth. Now, in this sector, there is money is not the driving force. It is non-transactional in nature, right? Now, for example, to be able to work with a public system, right, whether it's the state police during the pandemic, the public hospitals, the public schools, the works. You are not in a dotted line reporting format at all, right? They're not reporting to you. You are not reporting to them. You are not giving them money. They're not giving you any money. But the ability to still be able to establish that rhythm and be able to carry on the idea of being able to inspire people to do the task versus what is shown in the corporate world, I think is the biggest differentiator, right? Number one. The second piece is for far too long, while the nonprofit sector has had its own advantages, uh, there are clearly some processes and systems when we can bring in, we will be able to deliver what we're already doing in the sector at scale, right? And produce reproducible models, systemic changes which people can continue to keep working on, thereby building better scale, right? So I think it's clearly the ability to be able to bring these two together, and it would be a little bit of a primitive mode to try and say that what works there should work here, what works here should go there, because they're as different as chalk and cheese, right? But if we can learn the ability to marry the two, I think we've got a perfect working example, right? The corporate sector has for itself some of the great things going in there: structures, systems, use of technology, communication, right? Scale. This is something that the corporate sector has worked and has excelled over the years. The nonprofit sector or the social sector uh, has empathy, right? Has unfamiliar terrains and territories that we work in. No hierarchy, right? Uh, the ability that a problem has to be solved and the ability to go out and reach the last man standing. These are some of the advantages of the citizen sector, and if we can draw upon both these trends and cook together a perfect recipe, I think we've got it all.
I think that's very well explained and very well put. I mean, I can speak from personal experience. I mean, I served as a joint secretary of an NGO here in Jalandhar against plastic pollution for a year, and I again tried to bring in some of the best practices that you guys mentioned as well. You know, technology, processes, communication, clarity, and all those things. But it's very different, and the ability to bring them together is the basic challenge. Is the biggest challenge. It's not that the other person sitting across a desk, maybe it's a municipal commissioner or somebody one of from the local governing bodies is not thinking the same things that you're thinking, but yes, their way of doing things, and they have different stakes and they have different stakeholders to report to. So all those things, I mean, take some time. It's a learning curve. Also because I particularly think that in the last 12 to 14 years especially, we have seen a lot many people transition from their private jobs, corporate jobs, or some other kind of businesses towards the development sector. And I personally think it has a lot to do with more disposable income with people, and the passion to actually implement what they want to do, education, and just the growth of the economy as such. This also reminds me, I mean, I went to IIT Roorkee in 2007 to present a piece in one of the competitions over there. And in that year, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Manmohan Singh had actually, in one of the Independence Day speeches, I guess, said that India is today the NGO capital of the world. So I had very mixed feelings about it as to why do we need to be the NGO capital of the world? That means the non-governmental sector is needed more than the governmental sector. Is it so? And but the thing is, we are such huge and diverse that it's happening. And when we talk about people like Nandan Nilekani, who have set up like platforms like societal platforms just to add that extra bit of technology, reporting, monitoring, and evaluation, I think it has made the development sector in India very dynamic and much more efficient. Um, so talking about efficiency, what do you think is the basic requirement for any NGO to be able to be efficient? Because not everything can be quantified, not everything can be shown in data and numbers, because there are stories of last mile fulfillment which eventually drive an NGO and the founders and the team. What do you think are some of the ingredients for an NGO to be
The
successful
first,
today?
and thanks for asking this. I mean, truthfully, in all these years, I don't think anyone's asked me this. I'm so grateful that you've done this. A variety of things are important, Saurabh. And for us to define the success, it's also important that we understand the role that an NGO plays itself in today's world, right? More in an Indian context, what has been happening in the NGO space for the last 75 years, right? Every 15 to 20 years, we are seeing a dynamic shift in what the NGOs do. Right? At independence, the first, let's say, phase after independence, we were spending most time getting supplies from the government to the last man standing. So we were more about being a service delivery person, right? Or products were available, we had to go out and get it over. Then we slowly moved in from there to not just doing service delivery, but also being available in places where the government didn't exist, right? Establishing hospitals, establishing schools where schools, that was let's say a phase two for the next 15, 20 years. The phase three onwards, life started getting a little more interesting. We started pioneering solutions that didn't exist, right? And showcasing them as proof of concepts, right? The fourth phase, and this is assuming we're breaking it down into about 15 years, has been to be able to innovate and showcase to the government. And I think the phase that we're currently on is where we are able to demonstrate to the state what is possible. Right? So we've had about 5 different phases of this. Right? A lot of solutions now are something that's being pioneered, thought about as a think tank for the government per se, and the state then gets to adopt it. Right? Model schools for one. Right? We've been doing this now for a decade. Right? And we are so happy when we now start hearing the schools, state government say, "Hey, we want to have model schools." Right? So I think the ability to be able to see that through has changed. Right? Number one. So, what is the key ingredient? It's first important that we identify which segment we are continuing to target. However, that said, what are some of the key pieces we need to keep on? The passion to the cause is non-negotiable, and I think that's the foremost ingredient that we need to bring to the table. Right, number one. Number two, the the legalities of it. While a lot of them are working on this from a seva bhav standpoint, like no, the ability to serve, uh, many a times they seem to have unfortunately not remained compliant with the various laws. It's a changing model, and while we have corporates who are under scrutiny, I think the ability for an NGO to be under scrutiny is far higher because we are using purely public money to do this, right? So have systems and structures in place for compliance and transparency. So passion number one, transparency number two, the ability to quickly bring the best of both worlds, like you said, because there are tools that are available outside to be able to bring it in for scale is three. But I think the single most important piece now, especially over the last 2 years that has opened up for us, is for NGOs to plan for scale, right? From this point of saying, hey, we are the NGO capital of the world, we serve 400 people. The ability, what clearly was exposed in the last 2 years is nobody, and I'm sticking my neck out and saying this, nobody seems to have planned for scale. We are a 1.4 billion population, right? Uh, our solutions have to be scalable. Is this going to do a million people? Is this going to do half a billion people? We'll figure it out, right? But our solutions have to be scalable, and I think the role of the NGO is there in being able to build solutions for scale has not been more important than ever. Right? For example, and I'm just going to touch upon this, we all saw visuals of people carrying their luggage and walking on the streets. I think the last time India witnessed this was during the partition. After that, this was the first time we were actually seeing people carrying luggage and walking back. I think there was a super potential in NGOs who could have come together and perhaps established simple centers every 40 kilometers on the highway, right? So that the people who were walking back could have at least picked up two slices of bread, a packet of biscuits, had a cup of chai, and continued. Right? But the ability to think of scale, my operations are going to be local or hyper local, while the business world is trying to make that possible and ensure service delivery happens within 10 minutes. I think our focus to be able to break open the boundaries, right? If NGOs together had come in to establish over a 2,000 kilometer cycle, a simple kiosk every 40 kilometers, 45 kilometers, which is typically how much a person will be able to walk before they need a break, with a simple first aid solution. So that is something that I think we definitely need to step up on right now. Right? I personally see a lot of us not yet thinking of that scale. And with all of what's going around, especially with our neighboring countries right now, sooner or later we'll have to take some of the scale and be available to
Yeah.
for humanitarian assistance there. And I'm not spelling doomsday; it's just that the writing is on the wall. Bharat has Vishwaguru will continue to be able to showcase what is possible, and we can't have our neighbor's house burning while we rejoice here, right? So perhaps now is a time for nonprofits who have the hunger for scale. And for those who don't, we'll have to induce some appetite there for them to be able to think slightly bigger and go beyond that hyperlocal model that we are at. I'm not saying everybody needs to do it, but that's definitely a huge opportunity for the Indian nonprofit space.
Binu, I wanted to know from you, like what Ramesh said, a very that there should be a centralized approach as well, while hyper localizing your impact for NGOs. But like when I talk to people like Harshita Suneja and Aditya Male, who actually switched from corporate to NGO and then sometimes back to corporate as well, or I talk to Dr. Navneet Bhullar, who's been a doctor with Medicine Sans Frontier, working in Malawi in Africa and working in Jalandhar in Punjab, or Pallavi Ghosh, who's an anti-trafficking human activist working all over India, from East India to North India, everywhere. What I find in common in all of them is that they have so much to do that they're not able to focus or go beyond that, and their passion doesn't let them sit down, because they have to fulfill what they are trying to do. So is it because of the passion itself that you're not able to come out of it, be objective about it, and probably think about the vision? Or is it because of some external resources or lack of resources thereof that NGOs are not able to think about this? What is your opinion on that?
So, sort of to answer your question, I don't think passion is something which is stopping them from going ahead. I do not think so. However, yes, the possibility of having more resources, the possibility of having more like-minded individuals joining them. When we're talking about a cause, only there's not only one person who is trying to solve a problem. There are 10 other people also doing it at different level. So the point here is that why can't all of us come together and then march towards it? This is something we have not been seeing it personally in the last over a decade. We haven't seen. We are being candid over here. Even though there were times where the conversations had begun, where we said, "Fine, why don't we join hands and then solve the problem?" The problem has to be solved, and otherwise there is no point of us being here. We don't want to be here for 50 years. We want to let go of the problem and move on to the next level. However, that inhibition of joining hands is something that is still there. It is really prominent, and that is something we probably need to work on. All of us put together, whether it is us, whether it is someone else. If the names that you mentioned now, I'm sure they'll have similar issues as well. Right. So resources, yes, one way of looking at it. Yes, you need it at every day. However, you need people to be a part of the cause as well.
If I could what Binu said, resources for the sector will always be scarce, right?
Yeah.
The problem will always turn out to be bigger than the solution at hand. But I think the ability, how many of us can open source our solutions? Right? And if you can open source our solutions, each one calls it what they want,
Yeah.
but the ability to still go out and solve the problem, saying this is a framework to solve a problem, right? Here's how we respond when COVID strikes.
Yes.
Here's how we respond when floods hit us. Here's how we could respond when education, here's how we go out and set up model schools. And when once we open it up, right? Saurabh, with his wisdom and his connections, can adopt it and completely templatizes or localize it to a Punjab like setting. Somebody else can do this in the north, somebody else can do it in the east. But the ability, I think that's a classic story that we can again take from the corporate world to open source our solutions, right? Because the way to solve the solution, right, there could be a variety of reasons why this is not being done. Resources are one, but the way to solve this, we are never going to see a situation where we'll have more resources than what we need, right? And we will still continue to keep scraping the bottom of the pan. But if we can take a leaf from the corporate world and say we're going to open source the solutions, it's there. Here is how I have solved it. But for the next generation, here are those bit-sized nuggets through which you can go out and solve. I think we've got a classic solution in the waiting there for scale.
Which makes complete sense, actually. And Binu, I completely resonate with what you said as well, because we face the same thing in our NGO. Because that was my first thought. We are doing this for the first time. Why don't I just reach out to other people across India and the world, probably, who are already working on plastic pollution? But then, there are these things which come in unforeseen and so on. And to Ramesh's point of view, I think we there are so many organizations, and I'm associated with some of them, who are trying to do exactly this, helping NGOs come out of their own, I would say, limited thought process, and actually be see the abundance outside and share and collaborate and so
Yeah.
on. And that's what's absolutely needed. Okay, I think we've digressed a little from our conversation about Balutsa, but it was fascinating to know this part. I think I've never had this conversation before. um, why don't we do it in a slightly different way now, since we have described the NGO world and the processes there are and what you guys have been doing? Let's take it as a small exercise as to how will we solve a particular problem. And since you guys already know the answers, it will be easy. It is not going to be tough. So let's start with the fact that what is the difference between a private school in India and a government school in India? Does it make it more different if the government school is in an urban setting, or is it in a rural setting? What do you think?
uh, a, a sea of a change between a government and a private school, clearly, right? Uh, the focus itself is very, very different, right? And therefore, usually refrain myself from comparing the two because it's not an apple to apple comparison. However, that said, the goal of both of them is for the children to have physical, mental, and spiritual growth, right? While the approaches may be very, very different, the goal remains the same. The biggest change for people who are not yet familiar with the public education system is the fact that in a private school, it is fairly straightforward, single line hierarchical methods, right? There is a board, there is a principal, and in all probability, the principal is the final decision maker for all things academic, for all things cultural, for all things co-curricular. The public school education is is very different from that fashion because you've got different streams of people manning each of them, right? So you've got an entire administrative structure which exists in a public school, which is completely different to the academic structure, which could be very different from, let's say, a co-curricular structure like a sports that we may bring in, and they are just different layers per se. For whatever reason, at some point of time, the wisdom of the person allowed them to put it together, but that also means that execution becomes a lot more difficult on ground. Number one. Number two, therefore, is the way the public education system has been structured now is like any other government system, right? So you don't have a separate mechanism for recruitment for the education department versus any other department, right? So you still, let's say, and I'm talking of it more from the administrative standpoint. So let's say we still have a group A, group B, group C, group D. For the fisheries department or the choir department, we seem to have used the same template for the education department as well, right? So we are not looking at domain expertise or passion for the domain as a key consideration while recruitment, right? And therefore, this turns out to be amongst the biggest differentiators between the private school and a public school, right? In a private school, if there was not adequate experience in teaching, or if there was not adequate passion for children and learning, uh, the gates of the school wouldn't even open up for recruitment, which is not the case here, right? So, to begin with, both the fact that the system is so different um, in a public education system, administrative, academic, examination, textbooks, I mean, they're all different structures versus here where uh, a single body or a single person ensures that uniforms have come to the school on time, examinations are held on time, uh, answer papers are corrected and handed over on time. I mean, it's a lot more smaller of a segment that they deal with. At best, a school has a few thousand children, and this structure seems to hold good for a private school. Whereas in a public school, because of the sheer numbers and because also of the fact that for about 70 years we've not decided to change the system, and whatever works for another department, we've taken the same thing in here. Uh, the system turns out to be a lot more complex, number one. The second piece is, what is the price you pay for non-performance in a public school, right? Almost always in a private school, if a person is not performing, right, there is a price to pay, which is not the case in a public school, right? At best, if a person is not delivering or is not delivering optimally, the public school system can transfer the problem, not negate the problem. So person A goes from school X to school Y, or goes from school E to school district E to district F, and that's as much as what you can solve the problem. So this needs slightly systemic changes per se for us to be able to go out and fix this. Right? The system is fairly outdated, for want of a better word. The system emulates the other departments of the government, and therefore it is not dynamic enough to make this change. Two, three, because of it being having so many layers, the ability for who owns the responsibility of transforming the school changes. Four, there is no concept of perform or perish in the public schools. And the biggest change is, if a school doesn't function and if the entire school has to shut down because of non-performance, will any heads roll? The answer is no, right? Which will not be the case with a private school, right? 2 years in a row, if a school is not, let's say, a private school is not getting 100%, right? 100% results, and I don't want to limit it to the results, but just taking this as a sample, uh, there will be serious repercussions for the school. The management will decide to take it up. The parents will not be happy seeing the results. I mean, there is an ecosystem that will stand up to fight for it, which is not the case in a public school. We let it happen. We've allowed it to get to where it is. And unfortunately, we still don't have a situation where we are willing to go out and fix it as yet. And that's more because of the structural ways in which this is currently being done.
Binu, how have projects in BalUtsav tried to solve some of these problems because of the stark difference in management styles and the way things run in government schools and private schools? How has BalUtsav stepped in here?
So, sort to break the hierarchy in a public school, what we have done is that we signed an MOU with the ministry or with the DDPIs, the helm of affairs, the ones who are sitting at the helm of affairs, so that we have a blanket or we have access to the government schools in an area where we intend to work in. So, doing this helps us not reach out to individuals while doing our work or remodeling or reimagining public schools. So that has helped us over here. And that is something we also recommend other people working in the education space or who are working in the government school. Instead of directly going to the principal and seeking his permission, which is certainly required because we have to work in alignment together. Uh, you go to the body who can give you access to x or n number of schools that makes things easy for you. So that's how we work at BalUtsav. So our Sampurnishalas and Aishalas, Sampurnishalas are the ones which the schools that we run in urban areas where we have uh, uh, around 500 plus students in a school. That is what we look at. Aishalas are the ones in the rural parts of the country where the number is completely different. We do have schools with 40 students, we do have schools with only 100 students. So that's how we're looking at. However, we reach out to a larger body, they gives us permission, and we work forward from there.
That sounds very counterintuitive, actually, because most NGOs, they're supposed to fulfill the last mile. So obviously, you would imagine that you would be going with a bottom up approach. But what at BalUtsav you're trying to do is combine both the top down approach and also fulfill the last mile using that approach. So that's very interesting. How would you define your success so far?
So I think we've been reasonably successful in putting these schools together. One, to be able to demonstrate what's really possible in a public school. Today, it's been made quite aspirational for schools to walk up to us now and say, "Hey, will you take us up as a model school?" Right? From us having to go out and say, "Hey, this is our program. We need to take it in." The times have changed, and we currently have a waiting list of schools who have now come up and said, "Hey, we are up for grabs. We would like to work together to be able to take this on." Number one. Two, adding to what Binu said, the ability to both take a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach, and for want of a better word, to almost have a parallel system run to be able to keep the clock turning is the success model, right? We've now taken this into other states as well, and we've been welcomed there in the other states where we said this is what we want to do. So with about 200 plus schools as of the 2020-21 academic year, uh, and about 800,000 children plus, I think that's been reasonably successful. Uh, while the numbers per se seem to be fairly large, we are yet to hit 1% of India's children, right? And what we would like to do is really take this as an open source solution, establish one model school in every district of India, and leave it at that for everybody to see and emulate from, so that they could go out in their respective hometowns, in their respective cities, in their respective districts, to go out and say, "Hey, this is what I believe is a good school. It's demonstrated, it's served the purpose. There is reverse migration of children leaving private schools and coming back here, and we would like each one to go out and do this, because 10 lakh schools is not something that we would have the appetite for sure. We will probably close at between 7,000 to 10,000 schools in demonstrating that this is what may be possible, and then encourage everybody to take it up and do this in their respective places. So there's a proof of concept for the government to see, there's a proof of concept for other NGOs to pick up, and for the philanthropic space, for people who would like to invest, especially a lot of uh, CXOs who are now running great, at the helm of affairs of a variety of global companies. If they would again like to contribute something to their to the villages that they came from, we want to showcase that this is even possible.
That's amazing. But this does beg a question as to, when you have such a huge impact, or at least you're dealing with such huge numbers, and across regions. So what I have seen, by analyzing a couple of case studies. I mean, I was a mentor with Jagriti Yatra, and they introduced us to Akshay Patra Foundation. They introduced us to Arvind Eye Care, based out of Madurai, and now so many other states. Um, what I felt in all of them was that a centralized controlling body, or a centralized management system actually helped them create more efficiencies and replicate the model properly, obviously customizing it for the local environment, rather than people taking it up. I mean, it's a very crude analogy, but people taking it up as a franchisee in their respective district or something. It proved out to be more successful if there is a centralized management approach to that. So when you say that you want to create this as an open source thing, and people can learn from it and implement on their own, how would you like to address that particular challenge which might crop up?
So quite possible, sort of really, but we've used the word open source here with a lot of thought, right? So the ability for each one to pick up and build over it, like while this is a skeleton that we will make available, and we are putting it out there. Anybody now comes and says, "I want to do it," we are happy to give them that entire model. right? Now, unlike the product or service delivery exercise, what we put together is this open source skeletal that we want to leave people with, and definitely want people to go out and try other things, right? Add their own flesh and blood, add the localization component, and be able to take this in, right? It could just be our limited vision that this is what we thought is a perfect school, right? And this will continue to keep evolving. So we would like to keep it open source and leave it there for people to take up what works best for them. We would love to see more young blood come in and build over this and make these model schools maybe as super model schools at some point of time. We would love for that to happen. So there is a clear distinguishing that we've got here. One is to be able to see what others have typically done and maybe not take the franchisee route, but on the other side, take this as an open source route and say, hey, this is what we believe are key elements of a model school. But you are keen to go out and build over this or scrape off some of these elements. For example, when we started our schools, right, the there was no proof of concept which said what are the key ingredients of a school, right? That was always debatable, right? And when we first started and even spoke to stakeholders, said, hey, why don't we have music classes? It'll work on the the mental health of the children. Let's do dance classes. Let's do coding classes. I mean, we've got a whole bunch of those suggestions, and while I believe each of them are important, some of them turn out to be good to have things versus must have things in a school, right? So in our model schools, we built our model schools on four pillars: on infrastructure, on teacher development, on scholarship, and water sanitation and hygiene. Till today, uh, we have believed or we have seen for a fact that these four pillars of intervention definitely seem to have an impact on putting together a model school. But is there a clear study, for want of a better word, about the impact of water sanitation and hygiene in a school? It's quite fragmented, right? What we go by is if a 15-year-old girl child wants to come to school all 30 days in a month, one, she already has to go through a cultural barrier to show up in school. Two, does the school have the required supplies to make her stay in school for 30 days in a month, right? So it could be as simple as having a waste disposal mechanism in the school and running water in the toilets, which will ensure that a girl comes to school all 30 days in a month, right? Many of the studies, however, that have come out so far are largely studies put out by people who have a commercial interest in selling a product. And sometimes a study comes out saying, hey, listen, if a girl doesn't use a certain kind of a pad, the girls are not going to school, which is not the case. I mean, our own experience has been that it is not the lack of resources to buy a pad which keeps a girl away from school, as much as it is about the ability for the girl to come and stay in a school and be there for 8 hours during 30 days of the month, right? So it is these nuances. Now we've over the years evolved these mechanisms and we've put it out. So when we open it up, we would like for some of these elements to stay well. But by then, for example, if let's say there is a dynamic change and all girls across state governments decide to give menstrual cups to children, for example, right, who may need it. Perhaps the ability to go out and distribute sanitary pads, to have a vending machine, to have an incinerator for disposal may not even be required. And therefore, we're using the word open source here very, very carefully because few years from now, maybe some of these solutions could be redundant. Or maybe a few years from now, the need on the ground could be completely different. I mean, if we were having this chat in 2019 and you asked me saying, hey, do you think children should be learning from their tablets or their phones? The answer would have perhaps been a no, right? But of course, the last 2 years have changed things so much that we now believe that the ability to learn through a personal learning device is an integral part of the learning journey per se, right? So we're keeping it open source as much as we understand it, so that people can build over it, slice away things that we don't want, and add the elements or layers that could go out and get them to perform or deliver better.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, uh, It has been great having both of you over here. Just last couple of two questions, that I ask all the guests over here, so that some people who are learning, especially young people who would like to, be part of such a movement for, and also fulfill your wishes and mine, more young people into this space. I personally believe, I mean, this is the golden opportunity for India. We have the demographic dividend now, and we don't have jobs for them. They need to start working here. So I personally believe that. um, if if you had to give career advice to a young person who would like to follow in your footsteps, what would that advice be? Binu, I would
Okay.
like to start with you.
So I'll remove the word career here. Advice is something I'll stick on to. Uh, to begin with, be more empathetic, no matter what. It starts from home, and follow your thought process is what I would advise to anyone and whosoever is listening to it, especially the youngsters. And if any given point in time they have a calling in the development sector, they should pursue it. And as Ramesh initially had mentioned, we have so many youngsters who are taking it upon themselves to come up with solutions. And they're just not talking about problems, so which is a ray of hope for all of us. And we look forward to seeing young blood come forward and give us ideas to solve the issues. Ramesh, you want to add something?
So, yeah, I would be a little cautious of using the word career, but really in terms of professional advice, and that's how I would like to call this, because this doesn't fit into a typical career space per se, right? It is not about getting a hike every few years. It's not about vertical growth as much as it is with the other contemporaries that some of our young friends may have from the corporate world. But professional advice, I think the problems of the world are clearly written. The writing is on the wall. There is a huge need to get young blood, fresh new minds to come in and join the problem solving world. A, f- a few decades ago, the nonprofit space, and when I was talking about the history of the developmental world, I was telling you how at one point of time the dynamics of this was very, very different. Today, we've already started seeing people as early as 21, just out of college, taking up a full-time role in the development sector, right? And I think at that age, our young friends are fearless, are happy to experiment, and have that fire in the belly to go out and solve problems. So uh, when Binu and I started in 2009, and we would go in for a conference, we were possibly the youngest ones in the room back then. But a lot of it has changed from then till now. And when we walk in, there are people who are much younger, people who applied to jobs with us who are now partnering with us in a variety of programs. So I think the opportunity is huge. Your compensation may not come in terms of money, but I think in terms of satisfaction for my young friends, the problems there, the solutions are something that they can drive if the economic status of at home allows them not to have to take up a full-time job to to earn their next meal, wear a pair of clothes, and have a roof over their head. This sector needs a lot more people, and I would welcome and be happy to work with some of the younger minds in being able to craft the tomorrow that we envision.
Amazing. I resonate with all of those things that you just mentioned, both of you. Perfect. One last question. Um, and again, Binu, I would start with you. One sentence, one line that you would like to share, which will make the world a better place.
So I'll go with the tagline: education makes all the difference.
Perfect. What about you, Ramesh?
This is something that both of us will echo, Saurabh, really. The approach we've taken, and that's the hashtag that you will see being splattered all across social media as well. Education really makes all the difference. That's the one that will decide the route to take, the choices to make, and is a classic recipe for a better tomorrow. It's all
Amazing.
through education. If there's a better India that we envision, while we just rung in the 70 India at 75, and we plan for India at 100 and India at 125, the India that we envision can only happen uh, because education makes all the difference.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. And thank you so much to BalUtsav for doing what you guys have been leading the organization to do. And wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you
Thank you.
so
Thank you
much.
so much,
Thank
Saurabh.
you. Stay safe.